Good afternoon to everyone. I'm really happy to have a chance to speak to you today. I thank the ITEN for the invitation and appreciate the fact that people in various countries are now connected and listening to me. Um, Let me start with a little bit of background. And as you just heard, uh, I'm an economist, and so you may wonder what is an economist um, doing speaking about English language learning. It's not a topic that you would normally expect someone with my background to focus on. And it's a good question, and I have to say that if we had had this conversation a little bit over a year ago, I would have been surprised to have that I would have the opportunity to do this today. Now, why focus on English language learning from a public policy perspective? The reality is that English has become and is increasingly being recognized as one of the key skills of the 21st century. So we often talk about skills for the 21st century as those skills that students need to learn while in school in order to then, once they exit the education system, be ready and prepared to get a modern sector job and to be able to participate in a modern society that is increasingly globalized and interconnected. And quite often we focus on things like, skills like STEM or the ability to communicate, to work with others, to have creative thinking. We've come to realize that being proficient in a second language, and in particular in English, has become an essential part of sort of being of 21st century skills. English has become the lingua franca not only of trade and commerce and diplomacy, but certainly technology and science, as well as new fields such as culture and arts. And Interesting thing is that this is recognized not only by business companies that actually have for a number of years now been demanding or expressing their concern that there are not enough people to hire with sufficiently good English. Um, but also, I would say more broadly, by governments and civil society in general. So when we saw this, we thought, what are governments doing about this? And this is a very particular question because we know that societies in Latin America are highly unequal among socioeconomic and family of origin considerations. And those inequalities are often reproduced within the education system. So it's well known that the children of the elite have had many opportunities to learn and become fluent in English. The question, though, is given those inequalities that permeate through education systems in Latin America, will the kids from lower income and less privileged households have the same opportunities to learn what has become a critical skill? Otherwise, what we're seeing today will result in continued inequalities in the labor market down the road. And so that's how we got engaged in this conversation. I try to ask a fundamental question about public policies and how they are or not creating the conditions and the opportunities for access to quality English language learning in the education system for all Latin American children. And that's what we did. Um, Now there is really two main ways in which governments can um, approach the question of creating opportunities for English language learning. One is by setting the right policy regulatory framework, which then under which then schools operate. And the second one is to develop and implement specific programs to promote English language learning in schools. Today, I'll be speaking about both. The report that we completed and that you have access to, it's available both in English and in Spanish, looked at, considered 10 countries in the region. Argentina, Uruguay, Chile, Peru, Ecuador, Colombia, Brazil, Panama, Costa Rica, and Mexico. I think I didn't forget any. And we together these countries represent 85% of the population, and thus this offers us a pretty good sense of what's going on in the region. So the first thing is, as I mentioned, our government setting up the right policy framework. And to do that, we looked at a number of dimensions in these countries and looked at what governments were doing or had been doing over the last several years. Starting with the most basic aspect, and is English a mandatory skill to be taught in schools. And what we found is that indeed in most countries, now English is either mandatory, the teaching of English is either mandatory, or in those countries in which it's not specifically mandated by law, it tends to be one of the foreign languages that is indeed mandated. And after that, we also looked at other national strategies, and what we see is that a number of countries have those national strategies, not all of them, but increasingly countries are developing those and adopting those strategies that make English a priority and set up the basic conditions under which English will be taught in schools. Quite interestingly, many of these, we looked at what's the nature of those strategies and the justification for them. And in several countries, there's a very explicit statement that learning English is essential for competitiveness and growth, and that the goal is indeed to prepare students to be working in modern sector jobs that already require, and more so in the future, a command of the English language. And in fact, one strategy has influenced the other, and there's sort of a common thread on this regard. Now, in our report, we looked at a range of topics. I don't have the time to go into all of them in terms of this policy assessment. You can read it, and there's a very nice summary table which shows, gives a grade, if you want, for every country in each of these dimensions. They either get a check mark if indeed that policy dimension is adequately taken into account. It gets a little square if there is some positive movement, but they're not yet where they ought to be, and there's a check, a cross, if there hasn't been sort of that dimension is not present in the policy framework. Now, what do we see? We see, as I mentioned earlier, progress on a number of areas. But where are the main weaknesses? Well, the main weaknesses that we see are related to a measurement of learning by students and proficiency by teachers. So let me spend a few minutes on this. In most countries, some goals have been established in terms of what is expected from both teachers in order to be able to be English teachers and for students to graduate from school. And in fact, many countries have adopted the Common European Framework of Reference as the instrument to be used in order to determine those goals. So some cases they have as a goal, the most typical one is that students will graduate with a B1 level in that framework. There's a couple of countries that have a higher, somewhat higher standard. Likewise, increasingly, some proficiency standards are established for teachers. But, and this is a big but, in a majority of countries, there isn't a system in place, a mechanism in place to actually measure those that level of proficiency. It's actually more the exception than the rule that such a system exists. The reality then is that we simply don't know. The individual teacher may know whether their individual student is doing well or not based on their interaction, but we don't have a systematic way of assessing how well students as a whole are doing, and nor to identify where the problems are. Now, contrast this with the situation in most Latin American countries when it comes to the more traditional areas of teaching, Spanish, math, science. Today, practically every country in the region has a national learning assessment system that does exactly that. But the same does not exist for English, a subject that now is considered to be mandatory or highly important to be taught in school. So, as an example of a good practice, let me mention Chile, that measures English proficiency through their SIMSE scheme. SIMSE is their National Learning Assessment System. And now they don't do it every year, they do it just for some grades, but they are doing it. And the reality is for Chile, we know the progress and we can trace the progress that the education system is making in terms of learning, the learning of English. So back in 2004, when they did the first test, very few students achieve the standards that have been set up. And while not a majority meet those standards today, the increase is being very significant. And what you see both is an increase in the number of kids that achieve the desired level of learning, but also a reduction in those that have the lowest levels of learning. So that's if Chile can do it, probably all other countries ought to be able to do it, but we're still not there. Now, the situation is not better when it comes to assessing proficiency of teachers. You may argue that this is even a weaker, a more serious constraint, because the reality is that it appears that in a number of countries at least, many teachers are teaching English without actually achieving the level of proficiency that their students are supposed to achieve. So it is kind of a problematic situation. And while many countries have defined those standards, and defined the way in which they ought to be measured, they're not actually implementing, they're not measuring it. As a positive example, let me mention the case of Costa Rica, that I believe it was back in 2008, applied this test to those teachers that were teaching English. They got rather weak results. Based on that, they developed a training program, and several years after that, the same test was applied, and actually the improvement experienced by teachers was quite remarkable, which underscores the point that without having an ability to actually measure proficiency in a systematic way, we're handicapped in order to design interventions to actually help those teachers that need it. So this is sort of the big picture on policy, of good improvements in many areas and a big gap when it comes to having a system in place to measure learning outcomes. Let me also mention two other areas that we saw as lacking in a good, solid policy framework, and just put them there for your consideration. The first one is that while in most countries it's pretty clear what is expected from schools in terms of English language learning, the same is not true for higher education institutions. So even I mentioned Chile as perhaps the country with the most solid policy framework. In Chile, there's no policy framework applying to higher education institutions. So it all depends in Chile and in most other countries on the individual decision of an institution. Okay, so one university may establish that to be admitted, students need to have a certain level of proficiency, or that before graduation they need to demonstrate that level of proficiency. But the next door university may not. Okay, we simply don't know because there is no information on the subject. What we know is that it all depends on individual decisions. This is, I believe, a serious bottleneck going forward in a region in which enrollments in higher education institutions have skyrocketed. And based on that, we have is a larger number of students coming from lower income backgrounds that often have gone to schools that did not have before a good program to teach English. And so their weaknesses are going to be magnified by the fact that these universities are not going to be helping them achieve that level of proficiency, at least not in a systematic fashion. By the way, the idea is not simply to relearn or learn English, but also to actually deepen then the proficiency specifically in the area in which they will be studying and later on working. So there are targets that are or goals that are very specific to higher education. The second area in which seems to be a policy vacuum has to do with this range of academies and institutes that are not degree granting, they're not part of a schooling system, but that they actually provide English classes, English lessons to a very large number of students. Now, let's be clear, this is a positive trend that indicates that families are indeed interested in giving their kids opportunities beyond what may or may not be offered in schools. So clearly, nobody wants to discourage the operation of the sort of parallel institutions focused on just on English language teaching. The problem is that as a consumer of those or user of those services, it's very difficult to assess other than by word of mouth and reputation how good they are. And this is because they tend to operate in a regulatory vacuum. So really no country in the region has focused on this and come up with a thoughtful way of doing it. Here we have more questions than answers on what would be good practice, in part because nobody has looked at this in a rigorous and systematic way. Should there be accreditation of institutes, or rather accreditation of and certification of teachers? And what's the balance between regulation or regulatory structure by government as opposed to some form of self-regulation by this industry? So there's a number of important questions. But in summary, higher education and this non-degree granting training institutions are, I think, two areas in which there is a need for some thoughtful government intervention to enhance the opportunity for quality English language learning beyond schools. So that's a very quick overview of what we found in terms of the existence of an adequate policy framework influencing the teaching of English in Latin America. Now, as I said earlier, the other thing that the way in which governments can promote English language learning is through specific programs. So a program that actually allocates resources and other kinds of financial and other kinds of resources to promote the good teaching of English, high quality teaching of English within schools. And an increasing number of countries have such programs. I would say there's quite a bit of diversity. Not every country has such a program, and even among those that do, few have been in existence for a long enough period of time for us to be able to say that they've matured and that they are well-established programs. So a well-established program is one, well, almost by definition, that is sustained over time, that has a strategic goal, that is pursued in a consistent way, that has the right institutional setting, so it's not moving around all the time, but it actually fits somewhere within the bureaucratic structure of the education sector, and one that has the capacity to experiment and learn. And that calls for the existence of a well-developed monitoring and evaluation system. Perhaps the two best examples are the Programa Inglés Abre Puertas in Chile, the English Open Doors program in Chile, and then Ceibal en Inglés in Uruguay. The the Ceibal plan in English in Uruguay. Um, my sense is that well, they're certainly the longest running ones, and they have several of the features that I mentioned earlier as defining a good program. The Chilean program is the oldest in the region. It has been in existence now for, I think it's 13, 14 years, um, and it has gone through several presidential administrations. And the they have a number of very interesting features that I really encourage you to go and check their website. Uh, the Uruguay program, I'll say a few things later on because it has developed a number of innovations on the delivery side by bringing distance learning that I think are quite useful, creative, interesting, I know, a number of positive features. Um, Now, what is the main obstacle that programs are facing, English language learning programs? Eh, Not surprisingly, the key bottleneck is the insufficient number of well-qualified and prepared English language learning teachers. So it's hard to scale up when you don't have the human resources to do so. And this is perhaps not surprising, right? What you have is you are expanding or trying to expand rapidly the coverage of these programs because you recognize that this is important for the students to learn English. But having an adequate number of well-trained teachers is not something that you can do overnight. Um, it's actually something that, in the best case, you can do over a generation or two of students. And so there's this disconnect between the speed at which the ministries of education want to expand the coverage of the programs and the reality of a teaching force that is slow to adjust is what is becoming the key bottleneck. So, what are the key ways in which governments in Latin America are facing or trying to face this challenge? The first one and the most obvious one has to do with initial teacher preparation and training. We looked in the report at what's the situation in terms of how many higher education institutions are actually providing programs for English teachers and how good they are. Now, it's very difficult to find this information because in most countries the quality assurance system for teacher training institutions is rather weak. And so a majority of the institutions that have such programs are not necessarily being certified and accredited by the Ministry of Education or whoever is in charge of that function. And so that doesn't necessarily mean that they're not good, but it means that there's no guarantee that they are, or at least that they satisfy the standards that have been established often by law in terms of what an English teacher is supposed to be able to demonstrate in the way of proficiency. And this is both proficiency of the language as well as proficiency in the way to teach English as a second language. Again, this doesn't mean that they're not good. It means that as a matter of public policy, we don't have the assurances that they are. Again, I mentioned Chile earlier. It was interesting because during the last 4 years, they recognized that they had this problem where a majority of the programs had not gone through English language teaching programs, had not gone through accreditation, and in a very strategic way, they have been conducting a process whereby now most of the programs or the institutions that have such programs have gone through a process of accreditation, which is, I believe, the way in which it should operate across the board rather than being the exception, which Chile seems to be in this case. Now, a good initial teacher preparation is only half of the answer. You need opportunities for professional development and mentoring and support once for those teachers that are already teaching. And again, this is an area in which we do see ministries increasingly recognizing that it's important and developing initiatives. In practically every country, there are efforts to provide professional development opportunities for English teachers. One key aspect that we looked at in our report is the choice, let's put it that way, between doing training in country versus doing training abroad. The trade-off being quite obvious, doing it abroad in an English, in a country where English is the native language, provide opportunities for immersion that in principle ought to be, or at least in theory, ought to be strengthen the process of learning, but they're more expensive. So there's a trade-off there. Panama is the latest country to re-emphasize quite heavily the sending teachers abroad. And the question is, well, how do you make the choice? And is this a good investment or not such a good investment, considering the higher cost? Well, we simply don't know. We don't know the answer to the question because there are no studies that have measured what we economists call cost effectiveness of alternative modes of doing this training. A big gap, and certainly one that ought to be closed in the near future if we're going to know what we're doing. Otherwise, there's the distinct danger that we'll keep throwing money at what may or may not be the right solution to offer professional development opportunities for teachers. Now, even if you reform upstream the initial training of English teachers, and then you strengthen the range of ways in which teachers can further develop their proficiency while already in service. This is unlikely in most countries, given the low place from which we start. It's unlikely in most countries to generate the human resources needed for the expansion the countries want to have in a reasonable period of time. So I often refer to the case of Mexico, in which there are some estimates that they would need, in order to actually universalize the teaching of English in schools, they would need to hire an additional 85,000 English teachers. I believe that's not going to happen. That it will take a long time before there are 85,000 new potentially good teachers graduating from higher education programs. So this may be an extreme case, but what then? And in the report, we look at two innovations. One is the use of volunteers, foreign volunteers, to complement domestic teachers. The other one is the adoption of blended learning methods, be that through online resources or by distance learning methods, you benefiting from foreign teachers that you're not going to bring home, but that you can connect via video conference. And in both these areas, there are some interesting examples. Chile and Colombia have volunteer programs. The Chile program has been in place for a number of years, has been evaluated, has good results, not only in terms of the teaching of English, but more generally in terms of the positive influence that it has on kids learning about other cultures and countries, etc. On the issue of new technologies, this I mentioned earlier the case of Uruguay, and so Plan Ceibal is essentially the Uruguay's program for bringing new technologies into the classroom. So it's not specific to English, but they build a program focused on English language within that Plan Ceibal. And what is interesting here is that they quickly realized that they didn't have enough teachers to teach English at scale, but they had all their classrooms connected to internet, and that they could use that infrastructure to actually benefit from teachers that were not in Uruguay and that they could never afford bringing to Uruguay. And so essentially they're set it up with support from the British Council, so that now they have teachers teaching remotely from 5 different countries as far as the Philippines. And this program has been evaluated, showing good results. It's not free, of course, it has a cost, but Uruguay has, with this, being able to scale up a lot more effectively than they could have had they not used this innovation. Now, the question is, are you seeing whether it's this foreign teachers connected through video conferences, the use of software of various types, or volunteers? Are you seeing this as alternatives or as complements to having good teachers domestically? And this is a good question. I believe that in most countries, this has been seen as more as a complement than a substitute. And by this I mean that actually local teachers are actually learning and benefiting from whether it's the presence of a foreign volunteer or the joint teaching with an expert teacher from Britain, or the use of some online resources that can leverage their own personal ability to teach. So we're approaching I think, the limit of the time limit that I have for making this presentation. But let me conclude with a general sort of a big level, the high level message that I think is important. We don't see in Latin America a lack of interest and commitment to expanding the teaching of English in schools. What we see is serious capacity issues that are to some extent magnified by lack of progress in actually setting up appropriate measurement systems to measure proficiency both by students and teachers. We think the countries will need to invest more in teacher training and professional development, but at the same time, try to go beyond that and innovate and bring new approaches. In doing so, there's great potential in just going beyond purely national perspectives and really try to take more of a regional perspective, one in which we learn from each other and the experiences from one country that can inform what to do in other countries, but also perhaps even going further and thinking of solutions that are joint solutions across countries. This will require coordination, which is not often easy, but is an area in which I believe there is great potential. So let me stop here, and I'll be glad to answer questions if there are any. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fiszbein, for this excellent presentation. As you were saying, we open now the floor for questions or comments by our participants. While we wait for them to type down their questions and comments on the chat, I would like to start with this question. So, from your experience, what kind of incentives can you think of to encourage teachers from the different levels and also ministries of education to develop programs on the teaching of English in the classroom?
Good question. And I think that many of the weaknesses that we see in the area of teacher training or becoming an English teacher are common to other areas of teaching, and that's where incentives become important. This is a question as to how respected and recognized is the teaching profession in Latin America, and the answer is not enough. For that, you really need to act at both ends of the spectrum. You really need to make the more hierarchical, if you want, the whole process of recruiting candidates for teaching, but also make the invest more in them, both in terms of how much you invest in their training, but also how much you pay them over time. And this is true, I would say, for teachers in general. Now, question is, for the case of English, do you need special incentives to get more students interested in becoming an English teacher? I'm not convinced that if you have indeed, if you make the changes to make the teaching profession a more attractive one, you necessarily will need to have special incentives focused on getting students to teach English. It seems from some discussions we've had with some teacher training institutions that the problem they may face is that students that study English and at the university level may feel they have better job opportunities getting into the translation world or into very specific training opportunities for, say, for example, business people. Um, and in that sense, the school system may need to actually increase their, pay them better, and offer better working conditions to compete with them. Overall, I think this requires understanding the operation of that job market much better than currently we do.
Thank you, Dr. Fiszbein, for your answer. We have another question. Romina, would you like to share it with us?
Yes, Dr. Fiszbein. Can you make a reference to educational materials? Are they an obstacle for the teaching of English? I'm talking about the the availability of the distribution of the educational materials. Also, you talk a lot about technology, and so I don't know, for example, to what extent those traditional educational materials that we are thinking about, the written textbooks have been or could be replaced somehow by technologies. So I just want to know what's your opinion about educational materials and the teaching of English.
So, good question. Which means that it's not an easy question to answer. Um, it's very hard to find systematic information on how readily available teaching materials are in school. Now, there is no problem of availability in a more general sense. Okay, um, and you see this whole industry um, that exists and that is present in the region that has the technical and marketing, if you want, resources to actually make those materials available. And when you see what happens in private schools, that indeed works quite well. I'm not talking about how good the materials are, but in terms of availability. So, question within the public sector, within public schools, is more a question of how well the overall distribution efforts work, and we know that that varies across countries. Now, a more fundamental question, I think, is the second part of the question you ask is are traditional textbooks and booklets the solution looking forward, or should we start thinking more aggressively in terms of how to benefit from new information technologies to really transform the way teachers teach English and the resources they use. Now, there's no good assessment, I would say, of sort of a country that has done this at scale. But we do see is that there's quite a bit of innovation happening in the way of applications and so forth. but I'm not aware of any single country in Latin America that has sort of developed their approach to English language learning in schools through sort of a heavy focus on these resources. In my conversations, comes up the experience with Duolingo, comes up quite frequently. Some you may have heard about it. It's really an application that for self-learning of English that has achieved quite a bit of popularity. So it seems to me this is one area in which the calls for more R&D, more research and development, and again, it's one in which I would encourage, and I have encouraged ministries to collaborate across countries so that they have the sufficient scale to do this in a positive way.
Thank you, Dr. Fiszbein. I see that Andres Villalba from Argentina has placed a question on the chat. He is saying, keeping on the topic of materials, do you think materials created on a more localized focus could be more motivating for students? I mean, materials created in a classroom, in a school.
I wonder about that. And I had recently this conversation with people in the Ministry of Education in Chile. They were really putting quite a bit of emphasis on adaptation of teaching materials to the local context. And I have to say that I wonder whether that's how important that is. Um, yes, adaptation is always an appealing concept, but it's costly. It takes time. You can make a lot of mistakes, and so I tend to be skeptical of that. But again, it's not based on deep research and evidence. But I haven't seen yet the benefits of taking that approach. I think that what is more appealing in my mind is that when you innovate and find new ways of getting children, young people interested in a new way of teaching, that you take it to scale as much as possible, whether it's learning through music or videos or games. There's great benefits to doing it wholesale rather than trying to tailor too much, which could become quite expensive. This is a research question that needs more attention.
Thank you, Dr. Fiszbein. I see that we're reaching the time of this presentation. Before saying goodbye to our participants, I would like to share with you the link where you can access the materials that were used in this presentation. That includes the synopsis and also the recording of this webinar. They will be uploaded to the Inter-American Collaboratory on the Teaching Profession and the link that you see on the screens. And also you can access the recording of this webinar and other webinars related to the teaching profession on our YouTube channel at ready10.com. Let's see if we have more comments or questions from the participants. If not, Dr. Fiszbein, I would say it has been a pleasure and an honor to have you presenting with us. And thank you also to the participants that came to the live streaming of this webinar.
Well, let me also thank everyone for their interest and attention, and hope that you found this useful.
Thank you, Dr. Fiszbein. So I would say that this is it. This is the end of our presentation. We'll see you on the next COTEP webinar in the upcoming months, and we'll keep connected to continue the dialogue on this important topic. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.